Hey everyone, and welcome back to Scarlet Sprites. Today's just a really quick follow-up video to the last one that I did on the 8BitDo Sega Mega Drive Genesis Controller DIY kit, where I was having some real issues with getting the D-pad to work on that controller after putting the PCB mod in. Alright, so there's two things really at play here. The first I'm going to own, it's a mistake that I made, where I was powering up the controller by just holding the start button. And that's how you do it for their SN30 controller, which is 8BitDo's controller that they make for the Super Nintendo. And I was doing the same thing with this mod kit, and that's not correct. If you read the instructions, it says to hold in B and start to power up the controller. So I wasn't doing that initially. Once I started doing that, the D-pad worked north to south, but not east to west. So I basically had up and down, but not left to right. The second issue is a little bit more surprising, and I kind of put this back on 8BitDo. If you go to their website, there is a section for firmware, and they list out all of their controllers and their receivers. So you can go ahead and download the firmware and update all of their devices. There's nothing here for the PCB DIY kits, nothing. So I just assumed that nothing existed because nothing was listed under firmware. However, if you go to the tools section of the website, there's a firmware updater. Now yeah, that kind of makes sense that you would download the firmware updater in order to automatically update whatever device you had plugged in, but one, that's never how I've done any of their devices before. I've just downloaded the firmware straight from the firmware section and then applied the update. If you don't see a device listed, it kind of stands to reason that the firmware isn't available, and so the auto updater is not going to do you any good either. But user Schmeck626 weighed in and said, no, if you actually run that tool, it will pull an update for the PCB for the Mega Drive controller, which was awesome. So I went ahead, downloaded that, and this is the firmware that the device actually shipped with, which I think, going off memory right now, I think it was version 5.01, 5.10. Regardless, it jumped to 6 and applied that to the PCB. So once I had the new firmware and I was powering up the controller the right way, everything started to click and work the way it should, which is fantastic. However, the red blinking light that I referenced in the last video was still a problem. So every 15-20 minutes, this red light would just start blinking, I'd lose sync, and then I'd have to shut everything down, power it all back up, and try to sync it back up. So the blinking red light, per the instructions, is a dying battery, which is kind of what I mentioned in the last video as well, but it was odd because I was charging this thing for, 2-3 hours, and it should be fine. For whatever reason, the battery on the board just doesn't seem to hold a charge, and now I'm getting these disconnect issues, or I was. 8BitDo actually did email me back a second time, just wanting to collect more information, but by this point, I had taken a soldering iron and just touched where the contacts are on the PCB, where it makes contact with the battery, touched that up, added a little bit of flux and resoldered, reflowed the solder. It charges and it's fine now. So my controller is 100% fine. Part of it's on me, part of it's on 8BitDo, I would say, for hiding firmware for this thing. I don't know why it's a big secret. I mean, there's firmware for everything else that they have out there, but hey, that's their prerogative. But definitely wanted you guys to know that this thing is viable and it works, and I absolutely love it. It's exactly the mod and controller that I had hoped to have for the Genesis, and it works beautifully. So that's really it for today. If you have any questions, drop them down below, but you can get firmware for this device if you download the auto updater in the tools section. That's really the big takeaway, and always read your instructions. Read the instructions for your devices. That's it for today. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you all next time. Later, guys. Finally.